All right, class, welcome. We are going to start Unit 3, The Age of Revolution. This covers the American Revolution and the French Revolution. There is a lot here, and just for the American Revolution alone, I'm going to need to cut this into 2 videos, maybe 3. Um, so for this segment here, I think we will focus mostly on the revolution itself, and then we will get into the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. First thing I want to show you is the Declaration of Independence, and then we'll get into the other content. I hope you have some familiarity with this. I just want to point out a couple main points in terms of the ideas that this country is based on. You may disagree with them, but it's important that you understand what they are. Um, so this is Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. I'm sure you're familiar with that date. Big intellectual ideas that this country is founded on. Uh, Big idea number one. This is a revolutionary idea that all men are created equal. All right. Nobody in the secular government realm, nobody outside of religion had ever said anything like this. And it was revolutionary at the time. Now we kind of take it for granted. Yeah, all men are created equal, whatever. This was revolutionary at the time. It contradicted what the huge majority of people thought about humanity. All right, that all men are created equal. Now, I do want to point out something that you probably know, which is that the person that wrote this, Thomas Jefferson, was a slave owner. So to put it mildly, he's not exactly walking the walk. Um, and that's important for you to assess and understand. And that's one reason why, to connect to something we talked about in previous units, a lot of people are tearing down statues of Thomas Jefferson. However, let's just stipulate for the sake of this, why this is important. Was he a incredibly flawed person who didn't actually live up to this in his personal life? Yes. But the fact that he wrote this down as an aspiration, as an ideal that this country is supposed to live up to, that in itself was revolutionary. Next, I'm looking at the highlighted portion here. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay. Big idea number one in this document. Where do people get their rights? From their creator, from God. If you're not comfortable with that language, if you're an atheist, for example, fine, no problem. Fill in another word that you're comfortable with. You get your rights just by virtue of being alive. They're natural rights. You're born with them. Whatever term you want to use, God-given rights, natural rights, whatever it is, here's the important thing. It's important what he's saying here because of the implication of what he's not saying. In other words, if you get your rights from God or just by virtue of being born, here's what's revolutionary. What does that imply? Well, where do you not get your rights? This is huge. If you get your rights just by virtue of being born, where do you not get your rights? You do not get your rights from the government. This is profoundly important. It's revolutionary. It's a unique thing about this country ideologically. You do not get your rights from the government. Because if you get your rights from the government, if the government gives you your rights, then the government can take away your rights because you're basically just borrowing them. When the government feels like you should have rights, maybe they'll let you do something, but at any moment they can take those rights away from you. But since you have them from your creator, that means the government can't take them away. That is profoundly important. All other systems of government, what rights did people have? Whatever the government decided to let them do in any given moment. You understand? Our country was founded on the exact opposite principle. No, 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 no. You don't ask the government for your rights. You have them separate from the government. You have them before government even existed. I'm going to say it one more time. Say it with me. You do not get your rights from the government. That is a revolutionary idea. To continue this highlighted portion here, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men. All right, so why do we even need government? To secure the rights that we already have. Where does government get its power? From the consent of the governed, by virtue of voting for or against representatives, for example. What do you have the right to do if the government starts to violate your rights? You have the right to alter or abolish that government. And that's what Jefferson was doing in this document. The bulk of the rest of the document is a list of grievances or complaints, similar to, if you remember, the Protestant Reformation, similar to what Martin Luther was doing. Martin Luther had a bunch of grievances or complaints against the Catholic Church. This is Thomas Jefferson with a list of grievances or complaints against the British, explaining why he feels the need to separate, just like Martin Luther felt the need to separate from the Catholic Church. So the language, though, the ideological underpinning of this country is unique and it is profound. You get your rights from God, not from the government. The government's only job is to protect the rights that you automatically already have. The last thing I highlighted here, we'll get into this in more depth in a minute. These united colonies are, that's all plural language. These, plural, colonies, plural, are, plural, free and independent states, plural, they, plural, them, plural, free and independent states, plural. The further we go, further back we go in the history of this country was not considered one thing primarily. It was considered a collection of things. And you can see that in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson is not saying the United States is an independent country. He's saying these United States are independent. This country was considered a collection of things. Each state was almost the equivalent of an independent country. We'll get to how and why that changed a little bit later. This first thing here that I want to share with you is a passage that was written by Thomas Jefferson that was taken out of the Declaration of Independence. This was one of the grievances that was in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, but it was then taken out before the final drafts. He, that's reference to the King of England, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. He's referring to the slave trade. He is condemning the British for slavery, for enslaving West Africans and sending them to the American colonies. Thomas Jefferson calls that war against human nature itself. It is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. He's highlighting the word Christian to draw attention to the fact that enslaving people is not exactly Christian behavior. Determined to keep open a market where men, capitalizing men, driving home the point that these slaves are human beings. They're men. And they're being treated like animals. And he goes on and on and on. This is strange, to say the least, that Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, spent so much time and energy condemning slavery. Is that wildly hypocritical? Yeah. Is it important that he was at least putting the ideas out there? Yes, because a lot of this rhetoric set the stage for the abolitionist movement and the eventual end of slavery. This was taken out, as I said, of the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. You can probably guess why. The colonies, mostly the southern colonies that really depended on slavery in a major way, said to Jefferson, we're not signing off on this if you leave this in here, because we, the southern colonies, we want to maintain slavery after independence. And so this was taken out as a concession to the colonies that had a lot of slaves, right? They didn't want to hear this kind of language for reasons you probably understand. So let's go back a little and we'll lead up to the actual revolution itself, do a little bit of sociology, and then we'll pause before we get into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, because that in itself is a big, big, big topic. British officials took it for granted that colonials could not be granted the same rights as Britons. Okay, what does that mean? This was true throughout the British Empire. It was true in Ireland. It was true in India. It was true in Egypt. It was true in Nigeria. It was true in the United States. Whenever the British conquered a place, they were not going to give those people the same rights as Britons, specifically the right to vote and the right to have representatives in Parliament. Pictured here, this is the British Parliament. It's been held in the same room for hundreds of years. It's a small room. It's a small country. Britain's a very small country. And it is, within its own borders at least, it is a republic where people get to vote for their representatives, similar to the United States. But here's the thing, it's such a small country, but if it goes out and conquers other countries, is it going to give the people in other countries the same rights as Britons, the rights to have representatives in Parliament in London? It's not going to do that. When it conquers the American colonies, it's not going to give people in Massachusetts, for example, any representation in London. Same thing with Ireland, same thing with India. Think about India. The British conquered India. That's 1 billion people, right? India alone has exponentially more people than England, okay? If the English had given Indians, for example, the same rights as people in England had, the parliament in London would be like 85% Indians. You understand? And the British are not going to allow that. And the same principle with the United States. The United States, much smaller population than India back then, but it's the same principle. If the British gave the Americans the same rights as the British, the parliament in London would be over half Americans. You understand? And the British were not going to allow that. And that lack of equal rights, that lack of representation, it is one of the major causes of the revolution. There were divisions among the colonists as the revolution kicked off. This is very important to understand, because there's this mythology now of like everyone, all the Americans thought it was a good idea, and July 4th, yeah. It's not like that at all. There were major divisions. Loyalists refers to people that wanted to remain in the British Empire. Patriots were people that wanted independence, and neutrals were, that's a bit, it might have been the biggest group. Hey, leave me out of this. I want nothing to do with this. I don't want a war. I'm not really crazy about the loyalists or the patriots. I just want to be left alone to live my life. And so this was there was no consensus among Americans that the revolution was a good idea. No consensus at all. And in a lot of ways, it was a civil war between Americans to figure out which path to take. The arguments made by each group. The argument from the loyalists was the British aren't that bad, right? Grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, but be careful what you wish for. The British are not that bad. If we separate them from them, we have no idea what comes next. We have no reason to think that what comes next will somehow be better. And by the way, it's suicide to declare war on the most powerful empire in the world. You're going to get us all killed. That's the loyalist argument. The patriot argument is we don't have the same rights as the British, and that's not fair. We're being taxed. I'm sure you know the phrase taxation without representation. We don't get to vote. We don't have seats in parliament, but the British are writing our laws and taking our taxes. That's not fair. And we're big enough and powerful enough that we don't need them. We can be our own independent country. That's the patriot argument. The neutral argument is loyalists and patriots, y'all need to chill, leave me out of this. I'm just trying to raise my kids. Nobody wants a war. Pretty straightforward. So this was, again, basically a civil war within the United States, loyalists versus patriots, and then both sides are trying to convince the neutrals to join one side or the other. The British lost more than battles. They alienated the very civilians whose loyalties they had hoped to ensure. In New York City and other places, the presence of the British Army brought shortages of food and housing. In any war like this, there's different terms for it: an insurgency, a war of occupation, a guerrilla war, whatever term you want to use. The British are trying to win a war in another country. Okay. That's really hard to do, because if the civilians that live in that country turn on you, the foreign army, you can't win. You can stay there and fight for 100 years if you want, but eventually, if the people don't want you there, eventually you will run out of time and money and willpower, and you're going to have to go home. And then the people that live there, they win, because eventually you're going to need to leave. And so the British had an incredibly difficult job to do. Be in someone else's country when they don't want you there. That's almost impossible to do, right? The United States found that out in Vietnam and Afghanistan, etc. Doesn't matter how powerful you are, if the civilians that you're trying to control don't want you there, it's almost impossible for you to win that war. In New York City, so let's say a lot of people in New York City were loyalists. They wanted to remain British. They wanted to remain in the empire. But even they, the loyalists, if the British Army is in your city, this is simple supply and demand. The supply of people goes way up because you have a bunch of soldiers in that city. The supply of food and housing is not going to go up automatically overnight. You know what I mean? So supply and demand. The supply of people goes up because all these soldiers are there all of a sudden. Well, where's all the extra housing going to come from? New York City is very small and very crowded. You can't magically build a bunch of new houses overnight for all these soldiers. So where are they going to stay? Well, they're going to move into your house. And then even if you were a loyalist, you know what? You might change your mind. I was okay with the British, but now they're here sleeping on my couch, and food is more expensive because there's more people that need to eat, and there's not enough food, and there's not enough beds. I kind of want them out. Right? So being an army of occupation, if it's the British in America, if it's the Americans in Vietnam, it's the same idea. If the people don't want you there, you have almost an impossible job. That's what the British found out. Similar thing in Philadelphia as in New York. British occupation created hostility. The flood of troops jacked up prices for food, fuel, and housing. Again, supply and demand, inflation, right? Too many people wanting too few goods in terms of food, fuel, and housing. The British soldiers started stealing stuff from the civilians, looting their shops, harassing them on the streets. That's going to cause resentment. That's going to turn the civilian population against you. And when that happens, it's just a matter of time. Unless you are willing to stay as the occupying army, the only way to win this, if the people turn against you, is stay until the end of time or kill every civilian in the country. And neither one of those are realistic options. France had been waiting for an opportunity to humble Britain ever since the catastrophic 7 Years' War. We didn't get into the 7 Years' War in this case, but in this course, rather. But the British and the French were constantly at war with each other, back and forth over hundreds of years, right? They're historic enemies. And the 7 Years' War was another one of the many wars that the British and the French had fought. And it did not go well for the French. You don't need to get bogged down in the details, but the French want revenge. The French foreign minister took great interest in the drama unfolding across the Atlantic, meaning the revolution, and worked to turn it to his advantage. So the French got involved in the American Revolution on the side of the Americans. This is very common in human history. It's not because the French loved us. It's the enemy and my enemy is my friend. If we, the Americans, are fighting the British and the French are enemies of the British, the French are going to say, hey, we're now friends with the Americans because we have a mutual enemy. The enemy and my enemy is my friends. The Americans and the French both consider the British enemies during this period for different reasons. Therefore, the French are going to help us, again, not out of love for us, but out of mutual hatred for that third party. Without the French getting involved, the United States would not have won the revolution, or at the very least, it would have taken a lot longer. British leaders dismissed schemes to raise a black army. There was consideration among the British of telling American slaves to rise up against their slave owners, to abandon, to run away, and to join the British Army. And the British considered this plan, and their plan was, we'll get American slaves to rise up and join the British Army. And if they do that, we, the British, will guarantee them their freedom. That could have been very effective, but the British decided not to do it for political reasons. They were scared that if they did that, every white loyalist in the South would turn on them out of anger for the British turning slaves against the white Southern loyalists. So it ended up being not a moral decision, but a political / military decision. So the British, who were largely responsible for bringing all those slaves here in the first place, well, entirely responsible, really, they gave up, abandoned this opportunity to actually free those people that they had enslaved. So the actual war itself, the battles, I don't really want to get bogged down in that just because of time constraints. So let's flash forward to how the war ends. It was a long period. Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the war. It's a diplomatic triumph for the American negotiators for a few reasons. Number one, it made it official that the United States was an independent country. So obviously that's a win. That was the entire aim of the war from the Patriot perspective. Number two, it more than doubled the size of the country, because as you can see on the map here, it didn't just give independence to the colonies on the Atlantic coast. It stretched the borders of this new country all the way to the Mississippi River. That more than doubled the size of the country overnight. Now, you probably know that that territory, what is now, for example, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, etc., all that territory, that was Native American lands, and nobody, of course, asked the Native Americans whether they were okay with this. The Native Americans were not at the table. So all of this land was given to the United States. So the significance of this treaty that ended the revolution was the Americans, United States was now an independent country, and it was more than twice as large as it had previously been. For a decade after independence, after the war was won, the revolutionaries were less committed to creating an American nation, one centralized thing, than they were to organizing 13 separate state republics. And I'll draw your attention again back to the language of the Declaration of Independence. These United States, not the United States, these United States, plural. The original vision was every state is essentially its own country, and the only time they act as one united thing is if there's a war. But other than that, you know, it was almost I guess the vision would be similar to if you're familiar with the European Union in the modern context, the European Union is one thing. There's certain things they all cooperate on. However, in the context of modern Europe, right? Germany, France, Italy, etc., they're all still independent countries. They're not the same thing. They just get together on certain issues and cooperate. That was kind of the vision of the United States at first. So the federal government was incredibly weak. And here was one of the ideas that the founders had of why they didn't want one centralized, powerful government. Now, over time, that's changed dramatically, for better or for worse. We'll get into that later. But they believed, the founders, the United States was too sprawling, too big. And keep in mind, compare this to today. Now the United States is way bigger than it was back then, right? So that's still an issue. It's a huge country. And it's people too diverse then and now. This is an incredibly diverse country. And I'm sure you've noticed Americans don't agree on a whole bunch of stuff, right? And so because of the size and because of the diversity of people, opinions, ideas, values, religion, race, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the founders decided, you know what, this country is too big and too diverse to have everything be kind of centralized, top down, controlled from Washington, D.C. That was their view. They feared that the government of a large republic would inevitably grow indifference to popular concerns, being distant from many of its citizens. Again, this was the concern, and ask yourself if you think this makes sense. If all of the power is in Washington, D.C., and all of the laws come from Washington, D.C., rather than the individual states, in a country this big, this diverse, with this many people, the fear was Washington, D.C., the center of power, would grow indifference to what people actually need and want and think. One reason being it's so distant from many of its citizens. And look, this is even more true now. Like, you know, I put a picture of Hawaii at the bottom just to drive home this point. How far away is Hawaii from Washington, D.C.? I mean, thousands and thousands of miles, right? You leave Washington, you fly west, you get to California, you're less than halfway to Hawaii. Hawaii is very distant from Washington, D.C. So the question is, should people in Hawaii be governed directly? Should all the rules that apply to them and control their lives be coming out of Washington, D.C.? It's very far away. Do people in Washington really understand and care about what the average person in Hawaii is going through on a day-to-day basis? That was the concern. Okay. This country's too big, too diverse, too many different things going on. Therefore, the states should have the power, not one centralized government in Washington. The first attempt at a federal or national government was called the Articles of Confederation. It provided for a government with a national legislature, you know, a Congress, but Congress could not levy taxes. So there were no federal taxes, and they couldn't regulate trade. They really couldn't do much of anything. All of the power of the purse, that means the power to tax people and spend money, and the power to make and execute laws, all of that power was with the states. So the Articles of Confederation, yes, there was a federal government technically, but if they can't pass laws and they can't take your money through taxation, they don't really have any power. They're just sitting around debating stuff, and that's fine. But the idea was, even by the people that were very paranoid about having a big federal government for reasons I just tried to explain in that last image, even those people understood the Articles of Confederation. It was way too weak, because a federal national government that can't collect taxes or write laws, that's not a government. That's that's a debating society. And that was kind of, it was too weak, even in the opinion of people that wanted the federal government to be weak. This was too weak. So this did not last very long. It was not very effective. One of the in reference to how the country doubled in size overnight because of that treaty we just covered, one of the decisions, and this was true all the way through the history of the country up to 60 years ago when Alaska and Hawaii were added. If we have territory that we're going to incorporate into the country, and so this was the Northwest Territory right after the revolution, there's a few questions. How many states are we going to add? How big are they going to be? So let's just look at the Northwest Territory, for example. It's a pretty big territory. You can see colored in there. Is it going to be one huge state, the way Texas and California later would be? Is it going to be 30 really, really small Rhode Island size states? Or something in between? And they decided for something in between. They decided that ultimately it would become 5 states that you can see labeled here. And by the way, the other consideration that they had to make was these 5 states, for example, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, etc., they were not original, they were not in the original 13 colonies. So if we're adding them as states, are they equal members to the country? In other words, do they get senators and representatives just like the other states? Or do we treat them differently? And the decision was, no. Every state that's added, whether it's Ohio, whether it's, Arizona, 150 years later, when a state becomes a state, they have to be equal to all the states that have been there since the beginning. In other words, you get 2 senators, you get Congress people based on your population, etc. And that was a smart decision, because if they had treated these states differently and given them less representatives, those states might have refused to join the country. The other issue they had to figure out was what to do about slavery. The ordinance, the Northwest ordinance laws passed throughout these 5 new states, outlawed slavery throughout that region. That's good, but it also provided for the return of enslaved fugitives to the South. So let's look at the southern portion of that territory: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Those 3 states outlawed slavery. However, they bordered slave states. So if a slave in Kentucky escaped slavery and fled to Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois, where slavery was illegal, that slave could still be captured and returned back into slavery. Why did these states ban slavery? Was it out of sympathy for African Americans? No, unfortunately. It wasn't a moral decision. It was an economic and political decision. You know how we know? Look at this last sentence. Most of these states would pass legislation to exclude free blacks from settling there. How about that? No slavery. Good. Also, no black people. Because think about what they're saying here. If there's no slavery in your state, that's great, but it's obviously not a moral calculation, because they turn around in the same law and they say, hey, just to be clear, we don't want slaves. We don't want enslaved Africans in our state. We also don't want free black people in our state. So if there's no black slaves and there's no free blacks allowed, the intent of the law is obvious. No black people in Illinois, for example. So it's important to understand, in terms of slavery, it's been true throughout all human history. A lot of the opposition to slavery in different countries at different times was unfortunately not a moral opposition. It was more of an economic or political opposition. And you can see an obvious example of that reality here with the Northwest Territory. A little bit of sociological stuff around this period. Mary Wollstonecraft was a leader of, wasn't called feminism at the time, but what would eventually evolve into first wave feminism much later. Girls, she proposed, should receive the same education as boys. That's not a radical idea now in this country. It is in some countries, but back then it certainly was, including training that will prepare them for careers in medicine, politics, and business. Why? No woman should have to pin her hopes for financial security on making a good marriage. Education is a pathway to economic independence, and an economically independent woman, a woman with the ability, if necessary, to earn her own money, is much less vulnerable and susceptible to being trapped in an abusive marriage. Because very often, especially back then, when a woman was trapped in an abusive marriage, it was a well, it was literally a trap. There's no escape, because even if you tried to get a divorce, if you have no education, no skill set, no prospects of earning your own money, you could be trapped in a horrible situation by depending economically on the abusive husband, right? So this is an early attempt to argue for economic independence for women. And, the most obvious generic answer to how to do that is education. And again, the theory is we don't want women marrying out of financial necessity. We want them to have options, and, education provides those options. A little bit more on the early issues revolving I guess, gender roles in the early republic. The revolution prompted some states to reform their marriage laws, making divorce somewhat easier, although it remained extremely rare. So there's a couple things here. If divorce is made easier, but it remains extremely rare, even though it's easier, that tells you that during this period of the early United States, there was still a social taboo against divorce. In other words, it was considered a really bad thing, something that should be almost unheard of, a last resort. Right? There's a social taboo. And the way you know that is if you make something easy to do, but people still almost never do it, there's another reason why they're not doing it, right? There's some kind of moral, religious, societal reason that they're not doing it. Now, I want to flash forward a little bit into our history, because I don't think this issue will come up again, but it's important for you to understand in terms of the context of what's going on with this issue now in our country. Divorce now in the United States is not rare at all. And divorces are much, much, much easier to get. Most states now, flashing forward from this period, most states now have what's called no-fault divorce. And the further back in time you go, it was much harder to get a divorce. That starts to change gradually during this period, as they stipulate here. Here is the old traditional idea. Marriage is a contract, and you cannot uh, violate, or you cannot dissolve a contract without a specific reason, unless one of the parties has broken the terms of the contract, right? And so the old view was, to get a divorce, you had to prove that one of the parties, the husband or the wife, had violated the contract. And usually that meant proving the big three would be neglect, abuse, or abandonment. So, for example, your husband goes out for a pack of cigarettes, never comes back. That's abandonment. I haven't seen him in 2 years. All right, the husband abandoned you. That's a clear violation of the contract. You're going to get the divorce. But now, with no fault divorce, the idea is, don't make people prove things. Don't put all these legal barriers in the way of for example, a woman who's being abused, right? Make it easier to give people the ability to get out of a bad situation, right? It's an understandable impulse. I think you agree. But what that does sociologically is it changes how most people look at marriage, because here's the critique of no fault divorce. The argument for it is pretty clear. If a woman or man is in a horrible abusive situation, we don't want to make them, you know, scrounge up money they don't have to pay lawyers to prove the abuse. Like, that's a dangerous situation. We want them to be able to get out of a bad situation easily. Pretty straightforward argument, I think. The argument against no fault divorce is, if you can do no fault divorce, then marriage is just dating. Then marriage doesn't mean anything, right? Because, if you date someone and you break up, you don't need to go to court. You just break up and you go on, right? And so the critique against making divorce too easy is that it's redefining marriage as you're just dating. So I don't know if you're interested in that issue, something for you to think about. The trend over time, though, in terms of divorce being extremely rare, that it's no longer rare at all. You see the data here. The trend is very clear. Couple peaks and valleys, but basically it's up, 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 and it peaks in the late 1970s, and then it starts to go down. I want you to look at that critically and understand something. The divorce rate has gone down since its peak. That's true. Peaked about 45 years ago. However, the percentage of children born in this country now outside of marriage has never been higher. It is at a level now that people 100 years ago would not have been able to comprehend. They wouldn't have believed you if you told them. It's completely unprecedented. So how can both those things be true at once? The divorce rate's going down, but there have never been more children living in a house without a father. How can both those things be true? Well, if you never get married in the first place, you can't get divorced, right? So just because the divorce rate has gone down, the data you see here is true, it's misleading. More and more and more people never get married in the first place. Therefore, when they separate, it's not technically a divorce. They just break up or whatever. And so the percentage of children in this country growing up in a house without two parents, further back in time you go, that's an incredibly low number. That's 2%, 3%. And if you saw a child without a father living with the child 100 years ago, 200 years ago, chances are almost certain that it's because the father died. Right now, the majority of children born today are going to be born to a mother that is not married to the father. The majority. That's a wild sociological shift in the history of this country. And I don't know, you guys are young, but I don't know if that's on your radar or if it's important to you. It probably will be when you get a little bit older. The data is very, very clear that divorce is terrible for children. It is catastrophic for children. Not in every single case, of course, but in the aggregate, the data is kick you in the face obvious. Divorce might be good for adults because it gives them more flexibility. It is a disaster for children in terms of predicting bad outcomes for kids. Are they going to end up with drug problems, dropping out of school, going to prison, et cetera, et cetera? It, it, it kids that grow up without two parents in the house, the chances of bad outcomes for them rise exponentially. So there's a lot there. There's the sociological stuff. There's the liberty issue. There's what's good for the kids. There's what's good for the adults. There's evolving values around marriage in general. There's a lot here. And this is just a reminder that even as early as the revolution, people were debating things like this. When is divorce appropriate? How hard should it be to get legally, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of figuring out how to set up this new system, delegates came from all of the states except Rhode Island's. Rhode Island is the smallest state, and they were champions of states' rights. They wanted nothing to do with a project to strengthen national government. Rhode Island is a tiny, tiny state, and they were very paranoid that if there was a strong national government, they, Rhode Island, would just be swallowed up or ignored. The most important divisions to figure out in terms of how to set up a federal government, divisions between large and small states. I want to stipulate that doesn't mean physical size, it means population. Because now, if you think about the United States now, there are some huge states with very small populations. So when they say large and small, they don't mean size, they mean how many people are living there. And the other division was between states that were very invested in slavery and those that were not. So the people that are going to try to set up a federal government need to figure out how to balance all of these different interests. And here is the compromise they came up with. States would be equally represented in the upper house of Congress. That's the Senate. Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of how many people they have. That satisfied the smaller states. If you think about today, Wyoming physically is a very big state. Population wise, look, Rhode Island is physically teeny. Rhode Island has twice as many people as Wyoming, and Wyoming's huge physically compared to Rhode Island. That satisfied the smaller states. States with small populations, they still get 2 senators, just like the states with big populations. That satisfied the smaller states that were worried about being ignored. In the lower house of Congress, that's the House of Representatives, representation is apportioned according to population. That reassured the larger states. So this is a very delicate compromise, and it's worked for a long time. Small states without a lot of people get 2 senators. That reassures them. You can't just ignore Wyoming because they have 2 senators, just like California. But states with a lot of people get a lot more power in the House of Representatives. So therefore, today, for example, California has, 50 times as many representatives as Wyoming does because it has way more people. So both sides, small states and large states, they both make some compromise, but they both get something in return. It's hard to pull off, and it's a remarkably endurable system. It's been in place for 250 years. There's always going to be something to complain about, of course. California is going to complain about the fact that Wyoming has 2 senators and, relatively very, very, very few people. But that's a compromise California had to make to keep the country together. And Wyoming might complain that in the House of Representatives, they only get 1 vote out of 500, 400 change. But hey, you don't have that many people. You don't have that much power in the House of Representatives. So really interesting compromise. The Constitution also limited the powers of state legislatures. So this is the beginning of the process of stepping back from this idea that the states are almost like their own countries. Prohibiting them from, all right, here's some things states can't do according to the Constitution. Levying duties on trade, that's just fancy words for tariffs, taxing imports. So in other words, think about 2 states that are right next to each other, Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Neither Massachusetts nor Rhode Island can set up a checkpoint on the border between Massachusetts and Rhode Island and put extra taxes on things crossing that line. So in terms of the economy, this country is one economy. All right. You cannot tax things when they cross the border from Virginia into West Virginia or from, Rhode Island into Massachusetts. We're going to have one economy. Speaking of which, coining money, we have one economy, we have one currency, right? We don't have different currency used in Rhode Island or Massachusetts. Conducting foreign relations, we have one foreign policy. We don't have every state deciding their own foreign policy, right? We don't have Massachusetts declaring war against Spain for some random reason, but the other states in the country saying, no, we don't want to do that. We're not going along, right? So when we're at war, especially, we need to be one country and we need to all be on the same page. And in terms of the economy, we need to be one country. We're all using the same currency. We're not taxing things when they cross state lines. And if you think about, so look, I live in Massachusetts, but I am literally jump in my car and be in Rhode Island in 30 seconds. All right. The state line between Mass and Rhode Island is right around the corner from my house. I cross the state line between Mass and Rhode Island multiple times every day. I live in Massachusetts. I work in Massachusetts. I also work in Rhode Island. My gas station is in Rhode Island. My kids go to school in Massachusetts. My gym is in Rhode Island. I'm all over the place. I'm crossing that line every day. Boom, 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 boom. 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. If Massachusetts and Rhode Island were treated like different countries with radically different rules, different money, a border that you got to cross. What do I need a passport if I'm going to go to the gas station, right? That would not be very efficient. So the states still during this period were very, very different with very different rules. But in terms of big stuff, business and war, we're one country. That's what the Constitution sets out. In terms of how presidents would be elected, they would be chosen by the Electoral College rather than the popular vote. I'm sure you're aware of this. A lot of people don't like this. I just want to walk you through what it is, what it isn't. I'm going to jump ahead for 1 minute to say, okay, this frustrates a lot of people. I totally understand. I get it. Believe me, I understand the argument. What you see on the map here in terms of the numbers, the number of electoral votes that each state gets is based on the number of senators plus the number of representatives. So every state has 2 senators, regardless of how many people they have. But then states have different numbers of representatives based on how many people they have. So these numbers reflect that compromise that we talked about, where the states with few people get a little boost in the Senate, but states with a lot of people get a boost in the House of Representatives. So if you look at, for example, California, 55 electoral votes, that means they have 2 senators, just like everyone else. They have 53 representatives. So California gets 55 electoral votes. As a state, they have the most power in picking the president. Look at Wyoming, look at Montana, look at the Dakotas. They all get 3. They have so few people that they only have 1 representative and they have their 2 senators. Again, a lot of people can't stand this system. I totally understood. I want to point out a couple things. Number one, the huge majority of times when there's a presidential election, the person that wins the popular vote also wins the electoral college, and this isn't an issue. However, sometimes there is a divide. Sometimes the person that gets more votes in total in the popular vote actually loses, and that infuriates people. And I get it. The most recent time that happened, you're probably aware of, was in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million, but President Trump won the election by quite a few electoral votes. It actually wasn't that close. And the conventional wisdom is that if the election was done by popular vote, Trump never would have won this election. Okay, I'm not convinced that that's true. And let me walk you through a thought experiment here. California, 55 electoral votes. You need 270 to win. 55 is 1/5 of the entire total that you need to win. Right off the bat with one state, boom, you're like 20% there already. Let's look at California. Hillary Clinton won California, obviously. In our current political climate, any Democrat, even if they're dead, will win California over any Republican, period. Everybody knows that. Okay, fine. And let me give you an alternate example. Oklahoma only has 7 electoral votes, but whatever. Any Republican, even if they're dead, will win Oklahoma over any Democrat, regardless of who it is. Everyone knows that. So most states, everyone knows before the election even happens who's going to win. And what that does is it changes the incentive. There's a lot of people in this country that don't vote for different reasons. One reason is they live in a state that's not going to be close, so they feel like it's a waste of time to vote. If we got rid of all these lines and all these numbers and just had one huge election done straight by popular vote, I can make the case that President Trump still would have won this election. You know why? There's a lot of people in California. California is a huge state with a ton of people. A lot of those people are Trump supporters. A lot of them. Way less than half, of course, but still, in a state that big with that many people, there are millions and millions and millions of Trump supporters in California. But they know that Trump can't win California, so you understand a lot of them probably won't even bother to vote, right? And likewise, there's a lot of people in Oklahoma that would have wanted Hillary Clinton to win. But if you're in Oklahoma, you know she's not going to win your state, and you've had a long day at work, and you're not going to stand in line to vote for Hillary Clinton because your vote is going to be pointless. You understand? So one of the things that people don't like about the Electoral College is that unless you live in a state that's going to be really, really close, they're called swing states, there is an incentive for people not to vote because it seems like kind of a waste of time. Now, look, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is in the Constitution and it's not ever going to change. Because states that benefit from the Electoral College, states like Montana, Wyoming, right, the smaller states, they're not going to vote to voluntarily give up a system that kind of benefits them. You know what I mean? So love it or hate it, it's not going anywhere. Whatever, I'm recording this relatively soon after the 2024 election, and whatever you feel about the outcome, I assume you're either really happy or really distressed. And if you're happy, I'm happy for you. If you're distressed, I feel you. I've been there, and we're going to be okay. I will say a lot of people, even people that were upset, kind of breathed a sigh of relief that this didn't happen again. That the person, even if you hate the person that won, a lot of people do, fine. Even if you hate President Trump, a lot of people can at least say, okay, he won. There is no way on this planet to say he didn't win because he won the electoral vote and he won the popular vote by several million. And that, if you can separate yourself from the personality, just that fact that this didn't happen again. The person with fewer votes ended up becoming president. That was a sigh of relief for a lot of people. Um, but the reason why this was put in place, again, love it or hate it, was it reflects a much earlier, much different time when the states were very different and had a lot of independent authority. So the idea was the president is elected not by people, but by the states. That was the original idea behind this. The last thing that is in the Constitution that is no longer in the Constitution, it was excised after the Civil War, but it wasn't the original version of the Constitution, is very infamous. The 3/5 clause, it's what it's called. And there's some misunderstanding about this. So I want to walk you through what this is, what it isn't. And even though it's not in the Constitution, it still actually might be relevant. In the House of Representatives, where again, that's based, how many seats do you get is based on how many people you have. Well, what do we do about slavery? Slave states would be allowed to count 3/5, 60% of their slave population when determining how many seats they would get. And since the Electoral College is based on how many seats you have in Congress, that also means slave states have more Electoral College votes, had more Electoral College votes back then. Okay. The slave states, the states with a lot of slaves, you understand, they wanted to count all of their slaves because that would have given them even more seats in Congress and even more electoral votes. The states without slaves wanted slaves to not be counted at all. And they're saying to the slave states, whoa, 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 you can't count all your slaves as if they're citizens. They're not even allowed to vote. You can't take more power in the Congress and in presidential elections on the backs of people that you treat like animals. That's not, you can't do that. You got to pick one. They're either citizens who can vote, who should be counted, or they're not. You can't have it both ways. And so the compromise was, okay, the states with slaves can count 60%. So it was a compromise, right? Didn't make anybody happy. After the Civil War, when slavery ended, this also ended, the 3/5 clause. And now all people were counted, including former slaves. And when that happens, the southern states got even more houses in Congress and even more electoral votes. And the cruel irony is, you probably know this, after slavery ended in the South, did the southern states treat former slaves as citizens with all the rights citizens are supposed to have? No. No, they didn't. You know that. So after the Civil War, it actually got even worse in the sense that the former slave states who still treated former slaves like, you know, dirt got even more power because they said, oh, look, slavery's ended. Now we get to count everybody. And they're counting people that they wouldn't allow to vote. Now, here's how this issue is still sort of at play. The southern states were getting extra political power in Congress by counting people that couldn't vote, right? Today, slavery is dead and buried, thank God. However, in the modern context, are there today huge numbers of people in this country that can't vote? Yes, there are. They're not slaves. They are undocumented immigrants. Do certain states invite undocumented immigrants in large numbers into their states? Saying, for example, we will not cooperate with the federal government. You don't need to worry about deportation. Come to California. Come to New York. Yeah. Yeah. Do you see a parallel here? Throughout the history of this country, the Democrat Party has a tradition of getting extra political power on the backs of people who cannot vote. It used to be slaves. Now it's undocumented immigrants. What is the incentive structure here? If, in the modern context, a Democrat congressperson from California represents a district in which 2/3 of the people are undocumented immigrants and therefore cannot vote, that congressperson has power based on people that cannot vote. California has more electoral votes and seats in Congress because they invite in people that cannot vote. Okay. Do those Congress people in California have a reason? Do they have an incentive to listen to the concerns and the needs and the wants of those undocumented immigrants? It'd be nice if they did, but do they have an incentive to do so? Or can they say to those undocumented immigrants, you can't vote for or against me, so I'm just going to ignore you? You see the problem? In the history of this republic, whether it's slavery, whether it's undocumented immigrants, if there are big numbers of people in the country that cannot vote, certain politicians will try to get extra power on the backs of those people by pretending that they represent them. You understand? The Democrats used to do that with slaves. That's where the 3/5 compromise came from. Now they're doing it with undocumented immigrants. Either way, the overarching question that you should ask yourself as an American is, are you comfortable living in a country with huge numbers of people who don't have the same rights as everyone else? That's a problem. What the solution is, I have no idea, but it's a problem. All right, so wow, we're already over an hour, so I'll pause it there, and next segment we will get into the Bill of Rights. And I will see you then.